Julian Ross was 39 years old, and he had spent his entire adult life believing that a marriage was like an old stone wall, holding its shape simply because the stones were heavy enough to stay put against the weather. He had been stacking those stones for nearly a decade. And then one night, a Thursday, 11:14 p.m., on the 10th floor of an administrative building on Congress Avenue in downtown Austin, he sat alone under a humming fluorescent fixture with a black plastic pen between his fingers and 19 pages of separation papers spread across a mahogany table that smelled faintly of lemon oil. He was ready to sign his name. What stopped him was a 7-word text from the woman he was sitting there erasing from his legal life. "Don't forget my mother's birthday tomorrow." 7 words. No warm sign-off. Not even a punctuation mark at the end to soften the edge. Just that flat, functional instruction sitting on his screen like a reminder scrawled on the back of a grocery receipt. Julian set the pen down. He leaned back until the leather of his office chair groaned beneath him, staring up at the acoustic tiles where a water stain had slowly taken the shape of a continent over the winter. The kind of staring a man does when he is trying to dig through 10 years of shared coffee cups and silent car rides to find the exact junction where the rails had diverged. He could not find it. That was the most exhausting part. There had been no shouting match, no dramatic betrayal he could point to in an empty courtroom and say, "That was the exact moment we broke." It had been much slower than that, much quieter. The way a timber-framed house settles into its foundation over years of dry rot, without anyone noticing, until one afternoon the front door simply refuses to latch. His office was dark except for the wedge of amber light spilling through the blinds from the street lamps below. A delivery truck down on the avenue shifted gears, the sound echoing off the concrete canyons and fading into the humid autumn air. The separation papers rustled faintly as Julian let out a long, measured breath. Julian was a structural remediation consultant, the man insurance companies and commercial developers called when a building began to sag in ways the blueprints said were impossible. He understood load distribution. He understood the difference between a surface crack that could be patched with acrylic compound and a hidden fracture that meant the entire floor plate needed to come down. He had been trying to figure out which one his marriage was for nearly 4 years. Clara. Her name still felt heavy and warm inside his chest. Even here, surrounded by 19 pages asking him to turn a decade of history into a routine administrative task. He remembered who she used to be. The woman who laughed so hard in grocery store all strangers would turn around and smile. Who used to play old jazz records while she made pancakes on Sunday mornings, dancing barefoot on the linoleum. Who once drove 3 hours through a freezing downpour just to bring him a fresh thermos of coffee when his truck broke down on a highway shoulder outside of Waco. Sunlight in human form. Somewhere along the way, through mortgages and career shifts and the slow accumulation of unspoken grievances, that light had simply gone out. Now they lived in the same brick house on Redbud Lane like 2 passengers sharing a long-haul flight, polite, careful, and entirely indifferent. The kind of careful that is infinitely worse than arguing, because arguing at least required you to care enough about the outcome to fight for it. Julian picked the pen back up. He hovered the tip over the signature line on page 17. His hand did not tremble. "Do I have one more night left in me before I walk away for good?" What he could not have known was that within 24 hours he would stand in a dimly lit hallway and listen to his wife speak with a raw, terrifying honesty that would dismantle every single assumption he had built their life upon. He slid the papers back into their folder, shoved them into the bottom drawer of his desk, and turned off the desk lamp. The Austin night was warm and heavy as he walked to his car. "Come home early for my mother's birthday." Together. He had not thought about that word in a very long time. Maybe that was the root of it all. Whatever Julian was about to hear through a slightly ajar door the following evening was not going to save their marriage with a neat conclusion. It was going to crack them both wide open. And what lay inside that fracture was something neither of them had ever had the courage to name. The following evening, Julian arrived home 20 minutes early, parking his sedan under the live oak tree in the driveway, just as Clara had asked. She was standing in the master bedroom in front of the full-length mirror, zipping up a navy silk dress, the one he used to tell her made her look like she had just stepped out of an old film noir. He hadn't said that to her in 5 years. She caught his reflection in the glass, her fingers pausing on the small brass zipper at the base of her neck. "You're home." she said. Not "I'm glad you're here," just that flat acknowledgement, the kind you give a courier when a package arrives on time. "You asked me to be," Julian replied. The drive to her sister's house in Westlake Hills was conducted in near total silence. The radio hummed with low static between station signals. Neither of them reached out to turn the dial. Julian kept his hands steady at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. Clara kept her palms pressed flat against her thighs, staring straight ahead at the asphalt reflecting the tail lights of the evening commute. 10 years of marriage, and they had run out of small talk before they even hit the highway interchange. The dinner party at her sister's home was filled with the usual cadence of comfortable suburban life. Architects, accountants, and school administrators talking about kitchen remodels and college savings funds with the careful cheerfulness of people who lived in terror of an awkward silence. Julian shook hands, accepted a glass of sparkling water, smiled at the appropriate intervals, and watched Clara out of the corner of his eye. She smiled when people spoke to her, but the expression never reached the corners of her eyes. She held her wine glass without drinking from it. Her laugh, when it surfaced, was precise in its timing and completely hollow. Julian knew the difference between a wall that was load-bearing and one that had been skim-coated with plaster just to hide the rot beneath. Something inside his wife was coming apart at the seams. He excused himself after 40 minutes, claiming a work call, and stepped down the quiet hallway toward the back of the house where the guest rooms were located. That was when he heard it. The door to the small study was open about an inch. His wife was crying. Julian stopped dead, one hand flat against the cool wallpaper, his heart giving a sharp, irregular thud against his ribs. "I swear to God, I am drowning." Clara's voice came through the gap, ragged, shaking, and stripped of every defense she usually wore like armor. "Julian is the only man who has ever made me feel like the ground beneath my feet was real, but I pushed him away because of my own stupid, arrogant pride. My terrifying, miserable pride." His wife, crying alone in a darkened room at a family dinner because she was too afraid to let him see her fall apart. She didn't stop there. Through that narrow vertical crack in the door, he listened to things she had never once voiced to his face in 10 years of marriage. She talked about the autumn her father died, 2 years ago, a miserable Tuesday in November when the rain had turned the cemetery mud into a swamp. Julian had driven straight from a job site in Round Rock, his work boots caked in red clay, his flannel shirt smelling of diesel and damp earth. He had sat beside her on the folding chair under the green tent for 3 hours after everyone else had left. No grand speeches, no cheerful platitudes about time healing all wounds. Just presence. Just a solid, unmoving shoulder in the freezing wind. "That was the moment I knew he was my home," she whispered into the phone, her voice breaking on the consonants. "But I never told him. I couldn't bring myself to say it because I was terrified that if he knew how much I needed him, he would realize how little I actually had to offer in return. And the longer I stayed quiet, the heavier the silence became until it felt like an iron wall between us." Then she said a name that sent a sudden, cold jolt through Julian's blood. Marcus Vance, his former business partner, the man who had helped finance Julian's engineering firm during its leanest startup months back in 2018. Clara admitted that Marcus had been lingering around her office downtown for months, sending flowers that looked professional enough to pass inspection, stopping by her desk under the guise of catching up, whispering that she was wasted on a man who only cared about concrete and deadlines. "Some days I almost believed him," she confessed, her voice dropping to a miserable whisper, "because I was so hollow inside, and Marcus was standing right there handing me a narrative where I was the victim and the heroine all at once." Julian didn't storm into the room. He didn't shout or slam his hand against the doorframe. He simply stepped back, turned around, and walked out through the front door into the warm Texas night. He got into his car, drove aimlessly past the darkened storefronts of Bee Cave Road, and finally pulled onto the grass shoulder of a deserted stretch of feeder road beneath the overpass. The rain began to fall in heavy, erratic drops against the windshield. For the first time since he was a boy, Julian put his face in his hands and wept. Not out of anger at her, and not out of self-pity. He wept because he finally saw the terrifying symmetry of their shared loneliness. Two people who loved each other with a desperate, heavy silence, both of them treading water in the exact same deep end, both refusing to call out for fear of being a burden. "How quiet did I become?" he thought. staring through the fogged glass at the amber streetlights, for her to carry all of that heavy water entirely alone. When he finally returned home near midnight, the house was dark except for a single low lamp burning in the upstairs hallway. He walked up the wooden stairs and stopped outside the master bedroom. The door was open a few inches. Clara was sitting on the edge of the mattress, still in her navy dress, her face buried in her hands. He pushed the door open the rest of the way. The soft click of the latch made her look up instantly. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her mascara tracked in dark smudges down her cheeks. He thought of the woman he had heard crying through that narrow gap in the hallway, stripped of her armor, terrified and human. "I heard everything," Julian said quietly. The color drained from her face as if she had been struck. They sat on the hardwood floor with their backs against the bed frame, talking in low, exhausted whispers until the sky outside the window began to turn the pale, bruised color of dawn. At some point during those hours, Clara got up, walked to the closet, and pulled out an old cardboard shoebox from the very top shelf. Inside were every handwritten note Julian had left for her during their first year of dating. The paper soft and worn at the creases from being unfolded 1,000 times. And beneath those, tucked away like contraband, was the gray college sweatshirt he had lost 3 years ago and assumed was sitting in some donation bin across town. She had kept every fragment of him. Then came the confession that made the room fall completely still. Marcus had invited her to a private dinner at a boutique hotel downtown 3 weeks ago under the pretense of discussing a commercial real estate contract. She had driven there, parked her car in the underground garage, and sat in the driver's seat for 45 minutes with her hands frozen on the steering wheel. "Why didn't you go inside?" Julian asked, his voice entirely devoid of accusation. "Because I sat there and I thought about you," she said, looking straight into his eyes for the first time all night. "I thought about who you are, about the way you look when you're working late at the kitchen table, about every quiet, steady thing you've ever done for me without asking for applause. And I realized that stepping out of that car meant stepping away from the only real thing I've ever had. So I put the car in reverse and drove straight home." The silence that settled between them after those words wasn't the cold, guarded silence they had lived in for years. It was something heavier, something closer to the truth. What happened when they finally walked into a professional counselor's office the following week was not a cinematic breakthrough, but a slow, agonizing dismantling of the pride that had nearly cost them everything. Dr. Elena Vance had been a practicing family therapist in downtown Austin for nearly 3 decades, and she understood one fundamental truth about long-term relationships better than anyone. The marriages that implode are rarely the ones where people scream at each other in the kitchen. The truly dangerous ones are the quiet ones. The marriages where 2 people independently decide that protecting their partner from the messy, uncomfortable truth of their own vulnerability is the highest form of loyalty. She sat across from Julian and Clara in her 4th-floor office overlooking Barton Springs Road, watching them arrange themselves in the 2 leather armchairs with the hyper-controlled posture of people who were terrified that a single wrong movement would shatter the room. She recognized the posture instantly. 2 people who loved each other desperately, yet had been living as polite strangers in the same hallway for years, all in the name of keeping the peace. She called it what it was: emotional avoidance rooted in attachment fear. The paralyzing belief that needing someone is a weakness, and that if you show your partner how broken you really are, they will eventually pack their bags and leave. It is one of the most destructive forces in modern relationships because it operates in the shadows, leaving no physical evidence until the foundation has already turned to dust. Dr. Elena asked Clara to begin. Clara looked over at Julian, her hands tightly knotted in her lap, and began to speak about the evening at the downtown hotel. She didn't leave out the details. She described the way Marcus Vance had cornered her near the elevator bank, the smooth, rehearsed cadence of his voice promising her a life of excitement, freedom, and spontaneous adventure, the exact opposite of the quiet, predictable routine she had built with Julian. She described how close she had come to letting him pull her across that invisible line, and how sick she had felt on the drive home, vomiting over the bathroom sink, because the disgust she felt was directed as much at her own fractured vanity as it was at Marcus's calculated persistence. She had carried that secret alone for 3 weeks, letting it eat away at her from the inside out. When she finished, her shoulders were shaking with dry, exhausted sobs. Dr. Elena turned her gaze toward Julian. She had worked with enough men of his temperament to know exactly what was happening behind that wall of absolute physical stillness. He wasn't calm. He was utilizing every ounce of emotional discipline he possessed to keep his pain from becoming a weapon. Behavioral scientists call this effective containment under relational threat, the agonizing choice to absorb a devastating blow rather than retaliate, simply because the survival of the relationship matters more than winning the argument. When Julian finally spoke, his voice was flat, level, and entirely devoid of theatricality. "There's something I never told her either," he said. Clara looked up, her tear-streaked face tightening in confusion. 3 months earlier, Julian had been offered the position of Senior Vice President of Engineering for a major regional infrastructure firm based out of Dallas. It was a promotion that would have doubled his salary, placed his name on the masthead of every major trade journal in the state, and required him to travel 4 days out of every 7. His managing director had called it a once-in-a-lifetime career leap. Julian had turned it down without telling Clara a single word about it. He had felt the way an engineer feels when a support column begins to micro-fracture under a sudden spike in weight. He knew their marriage was too fragile to survive his permanent absence. So he declined the offer, kept going to his regular office every morning, and carried the quiet disappointment like a stone in his pocket. "You turned down Dallas for me?" Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "For us," Julian said, his eyes fixed on the grain of the coffee table. "And I didn't tell you because I didn't want you carrying the weight of my choices on top of everything else you were already drowning in." The room held that confession in the heavy afternoon air. Dr. Elena set her pen down on the notepad. "Do you both see the architecture of what you've built here?" she asked softly. "You each made a monumental sacrifice for the other out of love. And you each hid that sacrifice out of the exact same instinct, the desire to protect the other person from pain. But to the person standing across from you, that silence didn't look like protection. It looked like indifference. It looked like coldness. The very wall you built to keep the storm out was the wall that starved the garden." Both Julian and Clara recognized the truth in her words with the sudden, jarring clarity of someone waking up from a long, disorienting fever. Then Julian's phone buzzed sharply against the wood of the table. His younger brother, Marcus. No, his brother Nathan, calling from the warehouse in San Antonio. Julian let it ring twice before silencing it. Dr. Elena nudged the phone with her index finger. "Answer it," she said. "Put it on speaker." Julian tapped the screen. "Are you still sitting in that shrink's office wasting money?" Nathan's voice boomed through the small office speaker, loud and unfiltered. "Julian, listen to me. Sign the papers and get out. She hasn't appreciated you in 5 years, and everyone in this family knows it. You deserve someone who doesn't treat you like an afterthought." "Nathan," Julian's voice cut through the phone with a sharp, metallic edge. "You deserve a clean break, man. Stop letting her drag you down. You don't know anything about my wife." Julian snapped, his composure fraying at the edges for the first time all afternoon. "You don't know what she's carried, and you sure as hell don't know what I almost walked away from." He pressed the disconnect button with a hard swipe of his thumb. The office was dead silent. Clara was staring at him, her lips parted, her hands trembling where they rested on her knees. Then her own phone lit up on the small side table. A text message preview flashed across the screen from an unsaved number, though they both knew whose it was. 48 hours, and I'm on a flight to London. Last chance to choose a real life. You know where to find me tonight." All three of them read the words in the amber light of the office. It was a textbook execution of artificial urgency, the oldest psychological trick in the book. Set a deadline, manufacture scarcity, panic the target before rational thought has time to catch up with emotion. Clara picked up her phone. She looked at the screen for 3 long, unbroken seconds. Then, without a word, she raised her arm and dropped the device straight down onto the hardwood floor with enough force to crack the glass face completely across the middle. She turned her entire body toward her husband. "I choose you, Julian," she said. Her voice wasn't shaking anymore. It was clear, steady, and resonant. The voice of a woman who had finally found her way back to her own skin. "I have been choosing you every single day for 10 years. I was just too cowardly to say the words out loud when they mattered." Julian looked at her across the small space between their chairs. He looked at the history written in her eyes, the hotel parking lot, the rejected promotion, the shoebox of old letters, the long, silent nights spent treading water in the same dark house. He felt something shift inside his own chest, deep and permanent. The way an old structure settles into place when the load it has been carrying for years is finally distributed the way it was always meant to be. When someone tells you that you deserve more out of life, look very carefully at the machinery behind what they are offering. Real love doesn't arrive bearing deadlines, ultimatums, or demands for immediate surrender. Real love sits quietly in the dark with you when the foundation is cracking and waits for you to remember who you are. The most vital thing you can ever do for a marriage is to speak the hard, unvarnished truth out loud before silence turns your quiet sacrifices into a wound neither of you can reach. What happened months later at the annual State Engineering Association banquet in front of 300 industry peers, with Marcus Vance sitting just 2 tables away, was a public reclamation of everything they had nearly lost. But the hardest work had already been done in the quiet hours, away from the banquet halls and the polished floors, back in a house where the doors finally closed right, and the people inside were no longer afraid to speak.